Welcome to Twisted Roots, a place where family bonds are tested, broken, and sometimes rebuilt in the most unexpected ways. Here we don't just tell stories. We hold up a mirror to the quiet sacrifices, the hidden wounds, and the unspoken love that shape every household. If you've ever felt the sting of being unappreciated, if you've ever carried the weight of family silently on your shoulders, then these stories are for you. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next tale that just might remind you of your own. Tonight's story: my daughter-in-law called me a family embarrassment until her father recognized me. The sound of breaking crystal silenced the room. My champagne flute had slipped from my fingers, crashing against the polished marble. The shards fanned out at my feet, catching the golden light of the chandeliers like cruel little stars. The orchestra faltered, the laughter stopped, and then her voice, my daughter-in-law's voice, rose above the hush, smooth and practiced, laced with venom dressed as charm. "This," she said, turning to her wealthy parents, her manicured hand resting almost dismissively on my shoulder, "is the family embarrassment we're stuck with." Her smile was flawless, her words were daggers. 200 guests froze in place, forks hovered midair. Eyes widened, lips parted, whispers began to ripple through the hall like a current. I could feel the weight of every gaze pressing against me, each look a mixture of pity, amusement, or disdain. I stood there, 55 years old, a father who had given his son everything, a man who had built a life on sacrifice rather than display. And yet in one sentence I was reduced to a spectacle, a joke. No one stepped forward, no one defended me, not even my own son, too stunned to speak. The chandeliers sparkled above, mocking me with their brightness. The scent of roses filled the air, sweet and suffocating. Somewhere in the silence, I could hear my own heart pounding, each beat reminding me of every long night I had worked, every meal I had skipped, every dream I had set aside so that my child could have more. And now, in front of strangers and so-called family, I was branded the embarrassment. But humiliation has a way of igniting something deeper, a spark, a memory, a truth waiting to be revealed. What none of them knew, not my son, not his bride, not the sea of guests holding their breath, was that the story was far from over. Because sometimes the ones who are underestimated the most are the ones holding the power that no one ever sees. The silence that followed her words was heavier than any insult. I felt it before I saw it, the shift in the room, the air thinning as though every breath had been stolen. 200 eyes turned toward me, not with curiosity, not even with sympathy, but with judgment. It was the kind of silence that strips a man bare. At the nearest table, a woman in diamonds whispered something behind a jeweled hand. Her companion smirked, eyes flicking toward my scuffed shoes. At the bar, 2 young men in tailored suits nudged each other, their laughter low, cruel, the kind that never reaches the heart. And yet the sharpest wound was not in their words or their whispers. It was in their eyes. Those eyes carried stories. Some looked at me as though I had wandered into a place I did not belong. Others as though I were an inconvenience, an embarrassment they had been forced to endure for the sake of family politics. And worst of all, some looked with pity. The kind that poisons dignity, that says, "We will tolerate you, but we will never respect you." My son stood frozen a few steps away, his glass still in hand, his lips parted in shock. He did not speak, he did not move. In his silence I found a deeper ache than in the cruelty of strangers. I adjusted the pearl button on my cuff, a nervous habit I hadn't noticed in years, and lowered my eyes to the shattered glass at my feet. The pieces glittered up at me, reflecting the chandeliers, reflecting my son's stunned face, reflecting the truth I had lived for decades. I was invisible until I became a spectacle. The orchestra resumed quietly, an awkward waltz filling the void, but the damage had been done. The whispers spread like smoke. Everywhere I turned, another glance struck me as though I were an exhibit on display. Here stands the embarrassment, the oddity in the navy suit. I wanted to walk away, to vanish into the shadows where I had always felt safest, but instead I stood. I let their stares burn into me, let their silence pronounce its verdict, and deep inside something stirred, a memory of every night I had carried burdens unseen, every sacrifice made without applause. They had no idea who I truly was, not yet. I said nothing, not because I had no words, but because the words I wanted to speak would have shattered more than the glass at my feet. They would have shattered my son's wedding day. They would have shattered the fragile thread of family that still held us together. So I swallowed them. I let the silence cover me like an old coat I'd worn 1,000 times before. My suit was modest, navy, pressed by my own hands that morning. The tie was simple, borrowed from a department store rack years ago. On my wrist, a watch my late wife had given me when times were better. To most here, I must have looked painfully out of place. No designer labels, no polished cufflinks, no air of entitlement, just a man who had worked, loved, and lost. I had chosen my clothes carefully, not to impress but to respect, to slip quietly into the background, to let the day belong to my son and his bride. I never came to steal the light, and yet in that cruel moment the spotlight found me anyway. Inside, I felt the weight of years pressing down, the endless hours at jobs that broke my back but never my will. The nights spent awake, calculating bills, making sure my boy never went without. The mornings when I tied these same worn shoes, whispering a prayer that he might someday stand taller than I ever did. And still, here I was, reduced to a punchline. Branded an embarrassment, I kept my head steady, my face calm. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break, but behind my stillness a storm gathered. Each stare was a lash, each whisper a stone thrown. The truth is, silence was not weakness. It was discipline, it was dignity. It was a choice made by a father who had carried heavier burdens than insults and survived far worse than humiliation. So I stood there. TR letter 1EA7M, L letter 1EB7NG, holding inside a sea of pain and memory. My son might have thought I was frozen, that I had nothing to say, but in truth I was protecting him, protecting this day, because sometimes the greatest strength a father can show is in choosing not to strike back. What none of them knew was that this silence was not emptiness. It was a prelude, and when the time came, the quiet man they mocked would no longer be invisible. Long before the shattered glass, long before the whispers of 200 guests, there was another silence, one that began in a hospital room years ago. That was the day I lost her, my wife, the woman who laughed with her whole body, who believed that a simple meal shared with love was richer than any banquet. She was gone before her hair had even turned gray, leaving me with a boy still learning how to tie his shoes. Grief does strange things to a man. Some men break. Some men bury themselves in work. I did both. I worked because I had to, and I carried my grief like a second skin because there was no time to shed it. Bills arrived whether I cried or not. Rent came due whether I mourned or not. A growing boy needed shoes, books, a steady hand at the dinner table, even if that hand was calloused and trembling. I took jobs that chewed up my back and spit out my pride. I worked in warehouses, on construction sites. Even in night shifts no one else wanted. My fingers cracked in the cold, my joints stiffened with each season, but every paycheck meant another month my son could live a little better than I had. I still remember one Christmas when I couldn't afford gifts. I stayed up until dawn carving him a wooden train from scraps I found behind the workshop. His smile when he held it, that was my wealth. Not the kind you measure in numbers, but in moments. I lived years like that, simple clothes, modest meals, laughter tucked into corners of struggle. And through it all, I taught my son one truth: hard work is not shame, love is not weakness. Sacrifice is the quiet language of family. And yet standing in that grand hall, beneath chandeliers dripping with crystal and roses flown in from places I'd never seen, I realized how easily those truths could be forgotten. My daughter-in-law had not seen the nights I went hungry so my son could eat. She had not seen the years I stood in the rain, waiting for buses home from double shifts. She only saw what I was not, the flash, the glamour, the performance of wealth. I let her words sting me, but I did not let them define me, because I knew something she did not. The man she called an embarrassment had built a life out of ashes. He had raised a boy alone, without complaint, without applause. And in the quiet years no one was watching, I had become more than invisible. I had become prepared. What none of them yet understood was that my silence tonight was not surrender, it was patience. And when the truth finally rose to the surface, it would not just silence their laughter, it would change everything. As I stood there in silence, the broken glass glittering at my feet, I could feel the eyes on me like 1,000 tiny flames. Most burned with judgment, some with pity, but one pair of eyes set beneath silver hair, framed by the polished tuxedo of a man accustomed to power, stared at me with something different. Recognition. Robert Mitchell, the father of the bride, had gone pale. His champagne flute hovered just beneath his lips, forgotten as though frozen in time. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him as white as his crisp shirt front. His eyes, sharp and calculating, searched my face the way a man might search a half-remembered dream. I saw it happen, the flicker of memory crossing his expression, confusion first, then doubt, and finally dawning realization, the kind that cannot be hidden no matter how carefully one wears a mask. He leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing, his lips parting with a whisper I almost didn't catch over the hum of whispers surrounding us. "Margaret Thompson." He spoke my name like a secret he was never meant to say aloud. Around us the orchestra tried to recover, the violins straining to fill the air with civility, but no melody could cover the weight of that moment. Guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something had cracked in the flawless facade of the evening. Samantha, the daughter-in-law who had just humiliated me, turned sharply to her father. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Her voice, once sweet with arrogance, trembled at the edges, but Robert Mitchell's gaze never left me. His eyes held mine, and in that silence between us the truth pulsed unspoken. I remembered that look. 3 years earlier, in a sterile boardroom bathed in fluorescent light, he had glanced across a long mahogany table and seen me there, quiet, unassuming. Flanked by attorneys who spoke for me, he hadn't paid me much attention then. I was to him a woman accompanying paperwork, a widow perhaps indulged by her late husband's wealth. He hadn't realized that every decision, every clause, every figure on that contract had been mine. Now, standing in his family's grand estate, he recognized me for what I was, not a charity case, not a widow surviving on scraps of her husband's pension, but the woman who had quietly acquired Mitchell Holdings when his empire was crumbling. The very hand that had saved his family's name while letting him believe it was a faceless firm, a nameless investor. I watched his lips tighten, his hand lowering the untouched champagne. He swallowed hard, eyes darting between me and his daughter, who still clung to her certainty that I was nothing more than an embarrassment. "Is something the matter, Robert?" Patricia, his wife, asked softly, her diamond bracelet flashing as she touched his arm. But Robert didn't answer her. He only stared at me as if the ground beneath him had shifted, and in that instant I realized something. My humiliation had cracked the surface, but Robert Mitchell's recognition that would shatter the entire facade. The hall was still, as if every breath had been suspended in midair. The music had faltered again, violins quivering on half notes, cellos silenced by hesitation. All eyes turned not to me now, but to Robert Mitchell, the patriarch of this grand estate, the man whose word in business carried weight like iron. His hand trembled slightly as he set the untouched champagne flute back onto the table. The sound of crystal meeting wood was sharp, unnervingly loud against the hush of the room. "I've met him before," he said at last, his voice carrying not just to his family but across the marble floor, reaching the ears of every curious guest leaning forward to catch his words. The whispers ceased. Forks hovered above half-eaten plates. Every gaze snapped between us, between me, the man humiliated as a family embarrassment, and Robert Mitchell, whose expression betrayed both awe and unease. Samantha froze beside him, her smile collapsing, her grip on her mother's arm tightening. "Daddy, what are you talking about?" she pressed, her tone brittle, strained. Robert ignored her. His eyes remained locked on me, and I felt the weight of years of silence pressing down, memories unspooling in his gaze. "It was 3 years ago," he continued, his voice steadier now, each word landing like a gavel. "The acquisition meeting, the boardroom on Madison Avenue. Mitchell Holdings was on the brink. We were drowning under debt, desperate for a buyout to keep the company alive." Gasps rippled through the crowd, shareholders, colleagues, socialites who suddenly recognized the tale. Everyone in this room knew the Mitchell family had nearly lost everything. Few knew who had saved them, until now. "I remember," Robert went on, his hand gripping the back of his chair as though to anchor himself. "A quiet man sitting at the end of that long table. No fanfare, no titles. Just presence." He didn't speak much, let the lawyers do their part, but when he did, when he nodded, when he signed, everything changed. He turned, pointing slightly in my direction, his voice lowering, thick with astonishment. "It was you." A murmur erupted, swelling like thunder. Heads turned, conversations flared in hushed tones. Guests who had moments earlier dismissed me now studied me with fresh eyes, disbelief etched across their faces. Samantha shook her head furiously. "That's impossible. This is just some kind of mistake." But Robert's face had gone pale, his composure unraveling. No mistake, he whispered, though the microphone in the hall carried his words clearly. I know who you are. You're the investor, the one who saved my company, the reason Mitchell Holdings still stands today. The room seemed to tilt, the chandeliers overhead swaying though the air was still. My humiliation, those cruel words branded upon me minutes ago, had already begun to fracture. For the first time all evening, I lifted my eyes and met Robert Mitchell's gaze fully. I did not speak, I did not need to, because the truth, once named, has a way of speaking for itself. And in that moment, the family embarrassment had become something far more dangerous. The room erupted in whispers, like dry leaves whipped into a sudden storm. The words embarrassment still hung in the air, but now they tangled with something else, disbelief. Robert Mitchell gripped the edge of the banquet table, his knuckles white, his composure unraveling in front of the very guests who had always known him as untouchable. His gaze, still locked on me, carried a mixture of recognition and dread. It wasn't a firm, Robert said, his voice growing louder, steadier, as though confessing before a tribunal. It wasn't some nameless group of Wall Street investors. It was him, this man, sitting in our home tonight, quiet, modest, humiliated before all of you. He is the one who saved Mitchell Holdings from collapse. The whispers turned to gasps. Patricia Mitchell pressed a hand to her throat, diamonds glittering under the chandeliers as if mocking the moment. Guests craned their necks, shocked faces peering at me as though I were no longer the same man they had been told to dismiss minutes earlier. Robert pressed on, his voice cracking under the weight of truth. You all know the story. 3 years ago, our debts nearly sank us. The company my father built was bleeding. We begged for buyer, anyone with enough capital to shoulder the weight, but every firm circled like vultures, ready to carve us apart. He paused, swallowing hard, and then came a single investor. Discreet, unassuming, not interested in recognition, only in rebuilding. That investor, he lifted a trembling finger toward me, was him. The silence that followed was thicker than stone. I stood still, hands clasped before me, my navy suit suddenly transformed from plain to symbolic. In their eyes, I was no longer invisible, no longer the subject of whispers, but Robert wasn't finished. He didn't just save the company, Robert admitted, his voice now low. Almost reverent, he restructured everything, paid off debts, installed management that actually cared about the employees, our entire family's wealth, our very standing in this community. Everything has survived these last 3 years because of him. His words spread through the crowd like wildfire. The orchestra sat motionless. Guests who moments ago smirked at me now looked away, shame coloring their faces. Others leaned forward, hungry to hear more, to reconcile the contradiction between the man in the modest suit and the fortune whispered about in Robert's confession. Samantha's face drained of color, her lips parted in disbelief. No, she muttered, almost to herself. That can't be true, he's just... But her father cut her off sharply, his tone like steel. He is the reason you are standing in this room with your head held high. Without him, Samantha, you would not be celebrating your wedding in this estate. Without him, there would be no estate. The crowd rippled again. I said nothing. Silence had always been my weapon, my shield, and tonight it was my crown. For every insult, for every dismissive glance, the truth now roared louder than any defense I could have spoken. The man they mocked as a burden had been carrying their fortune all along, and in that moment I saw it in their eyes. The embarrassment had become the benefactor. The ballroom, once choreographed into elegance, now unraveled into chaos. What had been a celebration only minutes before dissolved into a sea of murmurs and gasps, a restless tide of disbelief surging from table to table. Guests leaned across white linen cloths, whispering names and numbers, trading half-remembered rumors with urgency. 800 million, someone said breathlessly. He was the one behind Mitchell Holdings. Another voice cut in, but look at him, how could it be? Their disbelief crackled in the air like static. Some stared at me with widened eyes, astonishment battling with shame for having mocked me. Others narrowed their gaze, trying to reconcile the man in the modest navy suit with the shadowy investor who had reshaped their business world. The orchestra sat frozen, bows hovering midair, unsure whether to play or put down their instruments entirely. At the center of it all stood Samantha, her cheeks drained of color, her composure fracturing with each passing second. The practiced smile she had worn all night collapsed into a tight, brittle line. She turned frantically to her father, then to me, searching for denial, for rescue, for some escape. None came. "This can't be true," she hissed, her voice trembling but loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. He's nothing." The words clung to the air, desperate, unconvincing, as if even she no longer believed them. And then my son, David, he stood rooted where he was, the color gone from his face, his hand still gripping the champagne glass as though it might anchor him to something familiar. His eyes darted between me and Samantha, his lips parting but no sound emerging. He looked not just stunned but betrayed by silence, by secrets he hadn't known existed. I saw the questions in his face before he spoke them. "Who are you really? Why did you never tell me?" For a moment the weight of 200 eyes shifted off me and onto him. Guests watched the young groom, waiting for his response, his judgment, his loyalty. Would he defend his bride? Would he denounce his father? Or would he simply break? The chaos of the crowd surged again. Murmurs became arguments, voices rising like waves clashing against the walls of the estate. The chandeliers above flickered with their reflection, as if even the light itself was trembling. And in the middle of it all, I stood still, silent, steady, while the world around me began to fracture. Because this was only the beginning. The truth had slipped into the open, and once truth enters a room, it cannot be caged again. As the voices of the crowd swirled around me like a storm, I found myself retreating inward, back to the years no one here had ever seen, the years that built the truth now threatening to spill into the open. It began 15 years ago in the small workshop my wife and I once shared. She was brilliant, an engineer with a mind that could untangle problems most men never even saw. While I worked long hours to keep food on the table, she worked long nights at the kitchen counter, sketching blueprints on scrap paper, her pencil tapping against the wood in steady rhythm. Her idea was small, almost invisible at first, a design to reduce battery drain in smartphones, something she swore would change everything. "It's not just an invention," she told me once, brushing back the hair from her tired eyes. "It's a doorway. If we're careful, if we're wise, this could secure our son's future." When she died far too soon, I thought that doorway had closed forever. I buried her with the sketches folded carefully beside her, unwilling to let the world take even that. But before she left, she had insisted we file the patent, and within 2 years that patent sold for $22 million. To most, that would have been the end of the story, a windfall, a sudden chance to retire in comfort. But to me, it was only the beginning. I could have told David then. I could have lifted the veil. Let him know his mother's brilliance had carved a path to wealth, but I didn't, because wealth, revealed too soon, can poison ambition. It can teach a young man to lean instead of stand, and I wanted my son to stand tall, so I told him only part of the truth, that there had been a settlement enough to keep us comfortable. He never asked how much. Perhaps he thought it was a few million, maybe less. He went on chasing his own dreams, believing he rose solely by his own merit. Meanwhile, I began the long, quiet game. First, conservative investments, blue-chip stocks that grew steadily, safely. Then, as I learned, I moved into technology startups, renewable energy, medical innovation. Each decision was measured, cautious, deliberate. Each win I rolled forward, each loss I studied like a lesson. Real estate followed, properties in emerging cities that others overlooked. Year by year, the fortune grew, 50 million, then 200. By the time the world staggered into a new decade, it had swelled beyond anything I had ever imagined. When my wife passed, we had been a family clinging to survival. By the time my son graduated, I had become the kind of man who could shift the fate of entire companies with a single signature. And still, I told no one. I lived modestly, an old sedan, a quiet apartment, clothes that blended into the background. I learned that true wealth does not shine in diamonds or gold, but hides itself in plain sight, disguised as ordinary. When Mitchell Holdings teetered on the edge of collapse, I stepped forward, but not in my own name. Through shell companies and trusted attorneys, I acquired what others thought unsalvageable. Robert Mitchell never knew it was me who held the pen. He saw only contracts, never the hand guiding them. For 15 years, I wore this mask of invisibility, letting the world think me small while I built something vast. All for one reason: to protect my son from the weight of knowing. And to ensure that when the time came, he would have a foundation stronger than stone. But now, here in this glittering hall, the mask was cracking. And as Robert Mitchell's words carried through the crowd, I knew the secret I had guarded for so long was slipping out of my hands. The 15-year silence was ending, and with it, everything was about to change. Most people would have stopped at 22 million. They would have bought the house on the hill, the car that gleamed under sunlight, the vacations on foreign shores. They would have wrapped themselves in wealth like a cloak and paraded it proudly. But not me. That money was never a trophy. It was a seed, one my wife had planted with her restless mind, and one I had promised myself would grow into something greater than either of us could see. The first years, I played it safe. Blue chip stocks, the kind you could hold onto through storms. Companies that made things people would always need: medicine, steel, food, energy. They did not soar, but they did not sink, and while others chased quick gains, I learned patience. By 2015, that seed had doubled, 40 million, 50, enough to change a life forever, but still I lived as if nothing had shifted. My car remained the same reliable sedan, my clothes the same plain fabrics. At the grocery store, no one would guess that the man counting change at the register could have bought the building itself. Then came the growth years. Technology was reshaping the world: apps that fit inside a pocket, devices that rewrote how we lived. I watched carefully, studied balance sheets at night by the yellow glow of a desk lamp. I chose companies not for the noise surrounding them, but for the bones beneath, the ones with vision, discipline, and necessity. I did not gamble. I calculated. Some failed, of course. Every fortune has its scars, but more succeeded, and each success I rolled forward like a wave, building strength. By 2018, I was worth 200 million, a number I never said aloud, not even in the quiet of my own home. To say it would have been to tempt fate, to invite pride where humility had kept me safe. Then came real estate, cities no one paid attention to yet. Neighborhoods others dismissed as too worn, too risky. I saw possibility where others saw ruin. I bought land when it was cheap, waited as the world caught up, and sold only when the value had multiplied beyond reason. And then there were the hidden plays: biotechnology, renewable energy, data infrastructure, places where the future whispered instead of shouted. I listened to those whispers. By 2020, when my wife had been gone 5 years and my son was carving his own life with hard work, I crossed a line I never thought possible. 800 million, but I wore it not like armor nor like jewels. I wore it as silence. I learned to disappear into the ordinary, because power, when invisible, is power at its purest. To the world, I was just a quiet widower living modestly off a pension. To those who looked closer, if they ever dared, they might have seen the truth. A man who could move markets with a signature, who owned pieces of companies that touched lives across continents. Yet I told no one, not my neighbors, not my colleagues, not even my son, especially not my son. Because this was never about money. It was about preparing, about guarding, about building a fortress so strong that my family could never again be at the mercy of chance or cruelty. And so, while Samantha smiled her perfect smiles and whispered that I was a burden, while strangers judged me by my suit and my shoes, I stood quietly, knowing the irony she would one day choke on. The man she had just called an embarrassment was the very reason her family's name still carried weight, and as Robert Mitchell's recognition echoed through the hall, I knew the years of silence had reached their end. The time for invisibility was passing. The time for revelation had begun. Mitchell Holdings had been on life support. 3 years earlier, their empire, once towering, once untouchable, was rotting from the inside. Bad loans, overexpansion, decisions made with arrogance instead of wisdom. The Mitchell name, once engraved on brass plaques and spoken with reverence, was whispered with skepticism in boardrooms across New York. Behind closed doors, bankers sharpened their knives. Competitors circled like wolves, each waiting for the right moment to pounce. Family was desperate, their legacy dangling by a thread woven too thin to hold. And that was when I stepped in, not with fanfare, not with speeches, not with a demand for recognition. I came like a shadow in the boardroom, a man seated at the far end of the table, silent as my attorneys moved the pieces. They thought me irrelevant, a figurehead, a name on a contract. They were wrong. It was my money, my decision, my risk. I bought Mitchell Holdings when no one else dared. Not because I needed another company under my name, but because I saw what others refused to see: good bones beneath the ruin. The employees were loyal, the clients still trusted the brand, the structure itself was salvageable. It needed discipline, not destruction. And so I became the silent benefactor. I poured in capital, but more importantly, I restructured the heart of the company. Debts were paid, reckless projects were trimmed away. New management was placed, leaders who valued longevity over vanity. Within a year, the company stabilized. Within 2, it thrived. But no one knew my name, not the newspapers, not the employees, not even Robert Mitchell himself. To him, salvation had come from a faceless corporate entity, a discreet investment firm that slid across the table like any other. He never suspected that behind the veil was the same man his daughter would one day call a disgrace. And that was the irony I carried quietly. While they raised glasses in their sprawling estate, while Samantha rehearsed her flawless smile for society's approval, their wealth, their name, their very respectability balanced on the invisible shoulders of the man they dismissed as nothing. I had no need for applause, no hunger for credit. I had promised myself that my fortune was not built for pride, but for protection. I wanted only to guard my son's future, even if he never knew how strong the walls around him really were. So I remained silent, a ghost in the ledger. A shadow at the edge of the banquet hall, but shadows have weight. And when the truth finds its way into the light, the world often discovers that the quietest figure in the room is the one who has been holding it up all along. If there was one truth heavier than all the money I had ever managed, it was this: I had hidden everything from my own son. I told myself it was for his good, that a young man should grow not under the shadow of fortune but under the discipline of work, that he should know the sting of struggle, the value of every dollar, the dignity of climbing with his own 2 hands. And for years I believed that lie. I let him think we lived comfortably but modestly, surviving on his father's pension and a life insurance policy. I let him imagine that every bill we paid was a stretch, every holiday gift a sacrifice. He worked late nights in college, took internships that paid next to nothing, bought his first suit from a clearance rack while I had the means to give him more. I watched him sweat, stumble, and rise again, never once telling him that behind his back I was building a fortress of wealth in his name. It was love. I told myself love in its most disciplined form, but love, when twisted by silence, becomes something else. There were nights I would sit at the kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp lighting stacks of financial statements, while in the next room he studied by flashlight, too proud to ask for help with his tuition. I could have ended his worries with a single check. Instead, I let him struggle, believing I was forging his strength. I can still see the way he looked at me when he bought his first car, an old second-hand hatchback that rattled with every turn. He was proud, glowing, telling me, "I did it on my own, Dad." I smiled, congratulated him, shook his hand like he was a man. And then when he left the room, I sat down and cried, not from pride, but from the ache of knowing he had carried a weight I could have lifted years ago. That was my curse, my silence. I had wanted to protect him from entitlement, from the rot of easy privilege. But in doing so, I had also walled him off from the truth of who I was, of what his mother and I had built together. He knew me only as a modest, aging father, a man scraping by, when in reality I was shaping the foundations of companies, moving markets with quiet decisions. And now in this hall under these chandeliers, I saw the consequence of that silence. My son stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as his father-in-law exposed my identity to the world. He did not know whether to be proud or furious or broken. And I had no defense, no explanation that could fit into a single sentence. 15 years of secrecy had been shattered in a single evening, and the pain of it was sharper than any insult Samantha could ever throw, because humiliation passes, insults fade, but the look in my son's eyes, the confusion, the disbelief, that wound might never heal. The hall had grown unbearably loud with whispers, but in my ears there was only silence. A silence that belonged not to the crowd, not to Samantha's protests, not even to Robert Mitchell's stunned confession. It belonged to my son. David stood there, his face pale, the weight of 200 stairs pressing against his shoulders, but his eyes fixed only on me. The glass in his hand trembled, then slipped from his fingers and struck the carpet with a dull thud, unlike mine. It did not shatter, but in that moment something between us did. "Dad," his voice was hoarse, tight, as though dragged out against his will. "Tell me it's not true." I opened my mouth, but no words came. His voice rose, cracking like a whip through the hall. "Tell me I haven't been lied to for 15 years. The crowd fell silent again, not out of respect, but because drama this raw is rarer than diamonds at a wedding banquet. 200 guests lined in. Their curiosity sharpened to blades. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man who had worked 60-hour weeks to prove himself, who had stood proud on his own 2 feet, believing that he had built everything with nothing but grit, and I saw the fury, the betrayal burning behind his eyes. "Did you really let me struggle?" he demanded, his words cutting deeper than any knife, "when you could have stopped it all with a single word? Did you sit there night after night, watching me break my back while you," he gestured wildly, his voice catching, "while you were this?" He did not have the language for 800 million, for investments and acquisitions, for the silent empire that had grown behind his back. He had only the raw vocabulary of betrayal. "You knew and you never told me." Every instinct in me wanted to reach out, to steady him, to say what fathers always say, "I was protecting you, son." But the words felt brittle, false like paper shields against fire. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, caught between awe and shame. Samantha stood frozen, her painted smile gone, while Robert lowered his head, unwilling to meet his daughter's gaze, but none of that mattered. In that instant, the world narrowed to 2 people, a father and a son, separated not by distance, but by secrets. "I thought we were the same," David whispered now, his voice lower but far sharper. "I thought every late night, every sacrifice I made, that it was ours, but now I find out it was only mine." "You?" He shook his head, unable to finish. The room seemed to close in on us, the chandeliers above flickering like judgmental eyes. I stood still, hands clasped in front of me, the same way I had stood silently in that boardroom years ago. But this was no negotiation. This was my son, my flesh and blood, demanding to know if the life he lived was a lie, and the truth was heavier than any fortune I had ever built. Yes, I had lied by omission. Yes, I had hidden everything, convinced it was for his good. But watching him tremble before me, betrayed on the day that was supposed to be his joy, I wondered if perhaps the real embarrassment was not what Samantha had called me, but what my silence had made of me. When humiliation strikes in public, some wilt. Samantha did not. Her cheeks were pale, her composure cracked, but behind those emerald eyes burned something colder than shame: calculation. Even as the crowd buzzed and her father confessed truths meant to stay buried, I could see her mind working, assembling pieces, plotting her next move. The whispers in the hall had not yet settled when she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and forced her smile back into place. It was brittle now, but still sharp enough to cut. "Maybe this explains a lot," she said, her voice pitched high enough to reach those closest to her. "If David's father really is this investor, then perhaps the family has not been entirely honest with us." The words slid out like poison in honey. They weren't aimed at me, they were aimed at my son. David turned to her, confusion deepening, but she was already pressing on, wrapping her arm through his as if to steady him, though her grip looked more like a claim. "Think about it, darling, all those years of secrecy. Doesn't it bother you that he never told us, that maybe he's been hiding not just money, but motives?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Some nodded, drawn to her insinuation. Others frowned, sensing the chill in her tone. That was Samantha's gift, turning even her own humiliation into a platform. That night, after the last glass was cleared and the guests had drifted back into their luxury cars, she began her real work. Calls were made, discreet inquiries placed. Within a week, a private investigation firm in Manhattan received a handsome retainer to begin digging. She wanted names of companies, paper trails, shell corporations, any thread that would unravel the tapestry I had woven for 15 years. It wasn't curiosity that drove her, it was ambition. She had grown up in privilege, studied business at Wharton, dreamed of inheriting her father's empire. But that dream had been snatched away when Mitchell Holdings passed out of his control. And now, standing across from me, she realized the empire she craved wasn't lost at all. It was hidden, and she was married to its heir. In her eyes, David wasn't just a husband, he was leverage. The detectives she hired specialized in asset tracing, in following the invisible rivers of capital that men like me used to stay unseen, and she funded it all with borrowed credit, convinced the payoff would eclipse the risk. My son thought he had married a partner. But what he had taken as love was, in truth, a strategy, a calculated investment. And as I sat alone in my modest apartment days later, sipping bitter coffee in the dawn light, I realized the game had changed. For 15 years I had chosen silence, but Samantha's ambition had broken that silence open. What had been protection was now ammunition, and my family, my son, was in the crossfire. That night, the silence of my apartment pressed down heavier than the chandeliers of the Mitchell estate. I had lived through grief, through poverty, through the unrelenting grind of survival, but nothing weighed heavier than the silence that now stretched between my son and me. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where years ago I had once helped him with math homework, where his mother used to leave her sketches spread like a second tablecloth. Tonight, it was cluttered with papers, financial records, old contracts, letters from attorneys. The sum of 15 years of secrecy lay scattered before me, mocking me with their neat rows of numbers. I poured a glass of wine, the one I had been saving for special occasions. It tasted bitter, though perhaps the bitterness came from me. Two voices wrestled inside me, neither willing to yield. One whispered, "Keep it hidden, protect him. He doesn't need the burden of knowing. Let him keep believing he built everything on his own. That's the gift you've given him, independence." The other whispered louder, "No, the lie is killing him. Every hour that passes without truth builds a wall between you. If you stay silent, you lose him not to poverty, but to mistrust." I stared at his photograph on the wall, David at 10 years old, missing a front tooth, grinning proudly with a fishing rod taller than him. Back then, his pride had come from catching a small bass in a muddy pond. My pride had come from watching him smile. That was enough, but he was no longer 10. He was a man, my son, yes, but also a husband now, and perhaps soon a father himself. And he deserved more than fragments of the truth, yet the truth was dangerous. I knew what Samantha wanted, what she was already chasing with her investigators and lawyers. If I revealed everything, she would seize it, twist it, lay claim to it through David. My silence had not just been about protecting him from privilege, it had been about shielding him from predators who smelled wealth like blood in the water. So I sat in the dark, the clock ticking past midnight, weighing love against honesty, protection against trust. I thought of my wife, her voice still lingering in memory. "This invention will open a doorway, but what you choose to walk through, that's up to you." Had I chosen wrongly? The night stretched on, no sleep came. Only the echo of my son's words, accusing raw, "Dad, have I been lied to for 15 years?" And in that endless night, I realized there are lies we tell to protect the ones we love, but sometimes those lies grow teeth. Sometimes they turn and devour the very thing we meant to save. Dawn crept in through the window, pale and unforgiving. I hadn't slept, but I had made a decision. The time for shadows was ending. If my family was to survive, truth would have to step into the light. It was Samantha who reached out first. A message arrived the morning after that sleepless night. "Margaret, let's have lunch, just the three of us. There are things we need to discuss, family things." Family things, two simple words, but I could already hear the steel beneath them. This was not an invitation, it was a summons. At noon the following day, we met at a restaurant far grander than I would have chosen. Crystal glasses lined the tables. Chandeliers hung low enough to catch the gold in every ring and necklace. It was the kind of place Samantha belonged to instinctively, the kind of place where modest people like me felt like intruders. She was already there when we arrived, 45 minutes early, seated at the corner table with the best view of the room. A designer suit hugged her frame, her hair perfect, her smile polished until it gleamed. Before us sat a Bordeaux that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. "Margaret, David." She rose to kiss us both on the cheek, the gesture more political than affectionate. "Thank you for coming." David shifted uneasily beside me, still pale from the revelations of the wedding. I could feel the tension in his hand, the way he balled his napkin tight as though clinging to something solid. Samantha didn't waste time. "I know the last few days have been surprising, but we're family now, and when family discovers they share something as significant as wealth, it's important to manage it properly." Her eyes locked onto mine as she emphasized that word, wealth. I said nothing. Silence was my weapon. She opened a sleek portfolio, sliding documents across the white linen. "I've spoken with an attorney who specializes in family foundations. I think it's the perfect way forward." David frowned. "A foundation?" "Yes," Samantha replied smoothly. "A legal structure where we pool resources, create a family board of trustees, and make decisions together. It's transparent, strategic, and most importantly, fair." Her smile sharpened. "The trustees would be you, me, and David. Equal votes, equal voices." I leaned back in my chair, letting her speak, letting her mistake my quiet for interest. She mistook patience for weakness. It was her greatest flaw, she went on, her voice polished like a sales pitch. We'd start with something substantial, 50, 60 million perhaps, enough to establish credibility in the philanthropic community, to make an impact. From there we could expand, coordinate investments, ensure the family's wealth grows responsibly. No more secrecy, no more misunderstandings. David blinked at the figure, his lips parting in disbelief. Samantha's hand slid across his arm, steadying him, guiding him. This way, she added softly, we all share responsibility, we all share the future. I studied her then, the flawless hair, the diamond-studded earrings catching the sunlight. The way her nails tapped the table in anticipation, and I understood this wasn't about transparency. It wasn't about family, it was about control. She wasn't asking for collaboration. She was demanding a seat at the helm of a ship she hadn't built. The waiter arrived with our meals, but the food might as well have been invisible. The real feast was on the table between us, power, ambition, inheritance, and for the first time in 15 years. I knew the day I had avoided was finally here, the day I would have to stop hiding, the day silence would no longer protect my son, the day I would fight. For most of that lunch I had sat quietly, letting Samantha talk. She outlined her vision of a family foundation, spoke of transparency, of shared responsibility. Every word was carefully chosen, every phrase wrapped in the silk of reason, but beneath the polish I heard only ambition. She thought she was laying the board, she thought she was arranging the pieces. What she didn't know was that I had already begun my own game, when she paused to sip her Bordeaux. I reached into my leather folder. Slowly, deliberately, I placed a slim file on the white tablecloth between us. The sound of paper against linen was louder than crystal breaking. Before we discuss family planning, I said evenly, I think it's only fair we put everything on the table. Samantha's eyes flicked to the file, then back to me, her smile twitching for the first time. I opened it with practiced calm. Inside lay records, documents I had obtained through my advisor James Harrison, phone logs, invoices, credit statements, private investigation retainer fees. This, I continued, sliding a page toward her, is a record of your payments to Ashford Private Investigations. 2 weeks ago you hired them to trace shell corporations and anonymous investors. Her face drained of color. David stiffened beside her, his eyes darting between us. And this, I added. Laying down another sheet is your consultation with Harrison Webb and Associates, a law firm specializing in family wealth disputes. I let the words hang in the air like a blade. Samantha's lips parted, but no words came. David finally spoke, his voice shaking. Samantha, you hired investigators against my father. She stammered, it's not what it looks like. I was just trying to protect us, to understand what we were dealing with. But I didn't give her room to weave excuses. I slid the final page forward, bank records. 3 new credit accounts, all opened last month. Borrowed against the assumption you'd gain access to family assets. That isn't protection, that's gambling on greed. The silence at our table was suffocating, but the restaurant around us seemed to hum louder, as if every clink of cutlery, every hushed conversation was amplifying the tension. David leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests, betrayal carving deep lines into his young face. You planned this, he whispered. From the beginning, Samantha's mask slipped. Perfect smile fractured, her eyes flashing cold calculation before softening again into false sweetness. David, listen to me. This is for us, for our future. Don't you see? Your father's secrecy is dangerous. I was just trying to make sure we weren't left out. I folded my hands calmly over the remaining documents, my gaze steady. No, Samantha, you weren't protecting this family. You were trying to control it. And now, everyone at this table knows it. For the first time since this game began, the board was mine. The silent man they thought could be cornered had just moved his queen into play. The restaurant had grown unnervingly still. The waiter lingered at a distance, sensing the tension coiling at our table like a storm cloud. Samantha's smile had vanished entirely now, her lips pressed thin, her eyes darting between David's wounded face and the stack of documents resting beneath my hands. But I wasn't finished. You wanted transparency, I said softly, my voice calm but heavy enough to anchor the room. Very well, let's be transparent. I drew out another folder, thicker this time. Pages filled with numbers, statements, and reports slid across the table like cards in a high-stakes game. This, I continued, is a financial profile of your family's estate. Samantha's breath caught, her hand shot forward instinctively, but I placed my palm firmly on the pages, holding them in place. You should hear it aloud. David's brow furrowed. Dad, what is this? I met his eyes. The truth your wife never told you. I flipped the first page. The Mitchell estate mortgaged at nearly 80% of its value, investment accounts systematically depleted over the last 3 years, not for growth, but to maintain appearances. I turned another page. Credit obligations tied to short-term loans. Your father-in-law's consulting fees, propped up by Mitchell Holdings, which, as you now know, survives only because of me. Each sentence fell like a stone in water, ripples spreading across my son's face as disbelief gave way to shock, then to something deeper, anger. Samantha's voice cracked, sharp with panic. Stop, this is slander, you have no right. I cut her off with a single look. These are not accusations, they are facts, and I have the documents to prove them. I pushed the file fully toward David now. He hesitated, then opened it. His eyes scanned the pages, his lips moving silently as he read. With each line, his shoulders stiffened, his breath grew heavier. At last, he set the papers down, his hands trembling. Samantha, is this true? She reached for him, her words tumbling out fast, desperate. David, listen to me. It's temporary. Daddy just needs time, another opportunity. But David pulled his arm back. No, he said, his voice breaking. All those times you told me we needed to impress your parents. All those nights you looked down on my father, his eyes burned with betrayal. You knew your family was already drowning. Samantha's mask finally shattered. The perfect smile, the polished composure, all gone. What remained was raw desperation, the ambition of someone who had gambled on a lie and just lost the last of her chips. I sat back, letting the silence weigh on her. For 15 years I had hidden my wealth. For 15 years I had chosen invisibility. But now in this moment, truth was my greatest weapon. And with the truth laid bare, Samantha had nowhere left to stand. She had called me a family embarrassment. But now the whole table knew. The only embarrassment here was her. Some people retreat when S letter 1 EF1, TH letter 1 EADT, B letter 1 ECB, foy bay. Samantha was not one of them. For days after that fateful lunch, the house was quiet, too quiet. David avoided her, his anger simmering into silence. Robert Mitchell shut himself away in his study, pacing like a man who had just realized the empire he'd once ruled now belonged to another. But Samantha was plotting. When the first letter arrived from a prestigious Manhattan law firm with her name printed boldly at the top, I knew the battle had shifted. She had chosen the courts. The letter alleged concealed assets, undisclosed wealth, deliberate deception of heirs and spouses. It claimed I had manipulated family structures to deny Samantha and her husband access to their rightful inheritance. It was laced with legal jargon. But its meaning was clear. Samantha intended to drag my fortune into the light, piece by piece, until she could seize control. David brought the letter to me, his hands trembling. Dad, she's hired lawyers, she's serious. I looked at my son, his face a mix of fear and exhaustion, and felt the weight of years pressing down again. Of course she's serious, I said quietly. Ambition rarely dies, it just changes weapons. Within a week, subpoenas followed. Requests for financial disclosures. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers in the corporate world, stories in society pages. Suddenly, the embarrassment of the Mitchell wedding was no longer a whispered insult, it was headline fodder. But Samantha had underestimated something. I was not new to battle. I had fought poverty, grief, and the merciless grind of survival. I had built an empire in silence, brick by brick, through discipline and foresight, and now, as her attorneys circled like vultures, I did what I had always done, I prepared. James Harrison, my advisor, assembled a team, not just lawyers, but investigators, auditors, strategists. Every paper trail Samantha thought she could use had already been fortified, every investment structured to withstand scrutiny. My empire had been built not for show, but for resilience. Still, the cost was high, not in money, but in family. David was torn apart. Caught between loyalty to his father and the woman he had vowed to love. I saw it in his eyes each time he visited, the silent question, why didn't you tell me sooner? Could all of this have been avoided? And Samantha, she did not stop. Depositions, filings, motions. Each move designed not just to win, but to break me down, to wear me thin until I surrendered. but she didn't understand. She thought wealth was power. She thought law was the ultimate weapon. She didn't know that the greatest power is patience, and the greatest weapon is truth. The first hearing was set. The stage no longer belonged to chandeliers and champagne halls, but to wood-paneled courtrooms and judges in black robes. And as I stood outside that courtroom, my son beside me, I realized this was no longer a family feud. It was war. The courtroom lights burned bright above us, but the real fire was in my son's eyes. Days of revelations, nights of silence, and weeks of watching his marriage unravel had stripped David of the gentleness I once knew. He stood now not as the boy I raised, but as a man betrayed, torn between loyalty and truth, between the woman he had married and the father he had doubted. The lawyers' voices faded, their arguments dissolving into a dull hum. Even the judge's gavel seemed distant, because at the center of that room there was only one question left to be asked. David turned to Samantha, his hands trembling, his voice low at first but cutting through the chamber like steel. "Tell me the truth. Did you marry me for love or for money?" The words echoed, heavy and merciless. The gallery behind us stirred, reporters scribbling faster, spectators leaning forward. Even Robert Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his proud posture wilting beneath the weight of his daughter's impending answer. Samantha's face was a mask cracking at the edges. She tried to smile, but it wavered. She tried to reach for David's hand, but he pulled away. For the first time, she looked small-cornered, caught between the truth and the lie she had lived for so long. "David," she began, her voice faltering. "Of course I love you. You're my husband. Answer me," he snapped, louder now, his voice shaking with anger. Not with excuses, not with rehearsed lines, just the truth. Did you love me, or did you love what you thought I came with? Silence, her lips parted but no words came. Her eyes flickered toward her attorney, then back to David. The calculation that had once given her strength was gone, replaced by a fear she couldn't hide. And in that silence the answer was clear. David's shoulders slumped as though the weight of 15 years of lies, his father's silence, his wife's ambition had finally crushed him. He closed his eyes, whispering not to her but to himself, "That's all I needed to know." The judge cleared his throat, the lawyers scrambled to regain control, but the trial was already decided, not by law, not by contracts, but by a single question asked by a broken son: love or money? And in that courtroom the truth had spoken louder than any verdict. The courtroom had grown stale with arguments. Lawyers traded accusations like bullets, papers shuffled like shields, but everyone knew this was no longer about the law. It was about control. Samantha sat rigid, her face pale but her chin lifted defiantly, as if still clinging to the illusion that she held the upper hand. David slumped beside me, his eyes hollow, the final question still hanging between them like smoke after a fire. I had listened long enough. Slowly I rose to my feet. The judge tapped his gavel, urging order, but the room was already silent. All eyes turned to me, the man they once thought invisible, now the one voice that could end it all. "I have heard your complaints," I began, my voice steady, deliberate. "I have endured the accusations, the whispers, the endless dragging of my family's name into the mud, and now I will make this very simple." I placed a single sheet of paper on the polished table. Across it was written a figure, $5,000,000. "You want money?" I asked, my eyes fixed on Samantha. "Fine, here's your chance. $5 million wired to you within 72 hours. You will keep your house. Your father will retain his consulting position. Your lifestyle will remain intact." A murmur rippled through the room. $5 million was no small sum. To many it was salvation, but I wasn't finished. In exchange, I continued, my voice hardening, "you sign binding agreements never to contact me or my son again. No calls, no lawsuits, no schemes. You disappear quietly, permanently. If you refuse," I leaned forward, my eyes never leaving hers, "then you get nothing, not a cent, and everything you've built on credit and illusion collapses. Your parents lose their estate, your father loses his income, and you spend the next decade drowning in legal fees you cannot afford." The silence that followed was electric. Samantha's attorney shifted uncomfortably, already calculating the cost of years of litigation against the certainty of $5 million, clean and immediate. Robert Mitchell's face crumpled. The proud man now looked more desperate than defiant. Patricia clutched her pearls, her eyes wide with fear. But Samantha sat frozen, caught between greed and pride, her lips trembling as if she wanted to scream but could find no words. David turned to her, his voice raw. So this is it, the truth in black and white. If you ever loved me, you'd walk away. If not, then you'll take the money. The room was still, everyone waited for her answer. For years I had lived as a shadow, hidden behind modest clothes and silent gestures. But in that moment I stood revealed, not as an embarrassment, not even as a benefactor, but as something far more dangerous. A man who no longer needed to prove himself. And I had just written Samantha's final chapter, with a number and a deadline. The decision came quietly, almost anticlimactic, after weeks of thunder and storm. At 11:47 on a gray Monday morning, Samantha's attorney placed a call. By 5 p.m., the contracts were signed, the money transferred. $5 million, clean and cold, exchanged for silence. And just like that, she was gone. No tearful goodbyes, no explanations, only a trail of credit cards she paid off. A designer wardrobe boxed up and moved out of David's apartment, and whispers in the social circles that the Mitchell daughter had chosen to travel abroad for a while. But those who knew better understood she hadn't left for adventure. She had been bought out of a life she never truly wanted, a marriage she had entered like an investment gone wrong. David filed for divorce within a week. The papers cited irreconcilable differences. But the truth lay deeper. He had finally asked the only question that mattered, and silence had been her answer. 6 months passed. For the first time in years, peace began to seep back into our lives. One Sunday evening, David called me. His voice was lighter, hesitant, but warm. "Dad, I've met someone. Her name's Sarah. She's a teacher. She doesn't know anything about all this. To her, you're just my father who lives in a modest apartment and drives an old car." I smiled, though he couldn't see it through the phone. "And how does she feel about that?" He chuckled softly, the sound of a man rediscovering himself. "She said it means you have your priorities straight, that family matters more than appearances." For the first time in years, my chest felt unburdened, not because I had won, not because Samantha was gone, but because my son had finally found what money could never buy, love without condition. When I met Sarah, I saw it in her eyes, the warmth, the sincerity, the way she looked at David not as a stepping stone, but as a man. No masks, no schemes, just two people walking the same road together, and that was enough for me. That night I sat by my window, the city lights blinking like distant stars. The world outside still measured men by their wealth, still bowed to power dressed in silk and diamonds. But I had learned in the hardest way that respect is not born of numbers on a page. It is born of sacrifice. It is the long nights a father works so his child can eat. It is the silence he endures so his son can grow without burden. It is the love he carries, even when misunderstood, even when unappreciated. So I leave you with this. Respect is not measured by wealth, but by sacrifice. And if you've ever doubted your worth because you didn't wear the right clothes, or drive the right car, or live in the right house, remember this: the truest value in life comes not from what you own, but from what you give. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, if it reminded you of someone in your life, I ask only this: share it, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories like this. Because stories, like sacrifices, are meant to be shared.